This video is not a comparison between the 2001 film and the real events of December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor is possibly the most hated war film ever made. Personally, it didn't annoy me that much. It was an attempt to bring awareness of the Japanese attack and America's entry into World War II to an audience who would not have otherwise known that Hawaii was even bombed during the war. I thought the idea of a pilot flying during the Battle of Britain, then at Pearl Harbor, and finally as part of the Doolittle raid was a bit over the top, but that's Hollywood. The two main characters in the film were Macaulay and Walker, who were played by Ben Affleck. Never thought I would say that name on my channel. And Josh Hartnett. The acting was totally pathetic, unless you were a young lady in your 20s, in which case you probably thought they both deserved an Oscar. I am not going to go through the plot, but basically, these two pilots find themselves at Pearl Harbor on December 7th and take on the entire Japanese strike force single-handedly while all the other pilots fail to get off the ground. While the film is complete fiction loosely based on the Pearl Harbor attack and timeline, the inspiration for the characters came from two men who were very real. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor caught the Hawaiian Air Force, known affectionately as the Pineapple Air Force, completely off guard. On November 27th, General Short received a war warning from Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall, advising that hostile action was possible at any moment and instructing Short to undertake such reconnaissance and other measures as you deem necessary. In response, all Hawaiian Army units were placed on full alert. However, after a week of heightened readiness, General Short decided to stand down on the morning of December 6th, giving his men the weekend off. Marshall's warning proved tragically accurate. When the attack came 10 days later, it found the chain of command unprepared. A few Army Air Force pilots scrambled into the air on their own initiative to engage the enemy, but with no coordinated defense. The limited number of operational aircraft were launched haphazardly as pilots arrived to fly them. Just before 8 a.m., the first Japanese bombs struck Wheeler Field, shattering the Sunday morning calm. Among the first to react were two young second lieutenants, Kenneth M. Taylor of Hominy, Oklahoma, and George S. Welch of Wilmington, Delaware. Both men, just months out of flight school, were still groggy from a late night of revelry. Dressed in tuxedos and white dinner jackets, they had started their Saturday evening at the Royal Hawaiian Hotel then, attended a dance at the Hickam Officers Club before finishing the night with a poker game at the Wheeler Officers Club. They had only turned in around 3 a.m. before being thrust into action. At the sound of the first bombs, Taylor leapt out of bed and threw on the closest clothing he could find, tuxedo trousers and a formal shirt. He rushed outside and ran into Welch, who shouted, "What the hell is going on? They are bombing the hell out of us!" Both young lieutenants quickly realized war had begun, though they weren't entirely sure who the enemy was. Stunned by the chaos unfolding around them, Taylor regained his composure and called Haleiwa, the auxiliary airfield on the North Shore where their squadron's P-40B fighters were stationed. He ordered the ground crew to prepare the planes for immediate takeoff. Without wasting another moment, the two men jumped into Taylor's red Buick and sped the 10 miles to Haleiwa, which had been fortunately overlooked in the Japanese attack plan. Upon arriving at Haleiwa, Taylor and Welch quickly strapped into their P-40s and took off to face the enemy. Not far behind them, Second Lieutenant John Daines arrived in another car and launched in the next available P-40. While Taylor and Welch are often credited by historians and media with achieving America's first aerial victory of World War II, there is strong evidence suggesting that Daines may hold that distinction. During the early moments of the second wave, radar operators on the windward coast observed Daines engaging in an intense dogfight with a Japanese Val bomber, piloted by Satoru Kawasaki, ultimately shooting it down. Tragically, Daines was killed later that morning as he returned to Wheeler Field after a second sortie, this time in a P-36 fighter. Misidentified as an enemy aircraft, his plane was shot down by friendly fire from nervous gunners at Schofield Barracks. When Taylor and Welch took off from Haleiwa, only the 4 wing-mounted .30 caliber machine guns on each plane were loaded. The 2.50 caliber guns remained inexplicably unloaded. Estimates suggest the two lieutenants got airborne around 8:55 a.m., tasked with patrolling over Barber's Point. Finding no targets there, Welch, nicknamed Wheaties, spotted about a dozen aircraft circling over the Marine airfield at Irwa. Calling out to Taylor, Welch shouted, "K Grits, I see Japanese bombers down there just like sitting ducks." Without hesitation, both pilots dove their P-40s toward the enemy formation of Val dive bombers. The novice aviators slipped into position behind the circling aircraft, each selecting a target and opening fire. Welch, with only 3 of his 4 guns functioning, fired a long burst at his chosen Val, watching as it began smoking, spiraled out of control, and fell toward the ground. In an interview shortly after the attack, Welch recounted, "Their rear gunner was apparently shooting at the ground because they didn't see us coming. I got him in a 5-second burst. He burned up right away." Although credited with the kill at the time, later investigations suggest that Hiroyasu Kawabata's Val managed to recover just above the ground and limp back to the Hiryu. Taylor, meanwhile, successfully downed the first plane he targeted. It was a short burst, but the guy immediately exploded into flames and rolled over, he said. "All I could see were those 2 fixed landing gears sticking up." He crashed very close to Iwa. After watching the first Val plummet to the ground, Welch executed a vertical loop to reposition himself and lined up another D-3A in his sights. Describing the encounter, Welch said, "I left him and got the next plane in a circle about 100 yards ahead of him. It took about 3 bursts of 5 seconds each to get him. He crashed on the beach." As Welch's .30 caliber machine guns shredded Hajime Goto's Val, the rear gunner managed to return fire, forcing Welch to break off his attack. According to Japanese accounts, Taylor then engaged the same Val, delivering additional hits and wounding the gunner before the plane went down. Amid the chaos and unaware of Welch's engagement with Goto, Taylor later recounted his perspective on the action. "With my first burst, I killed his rear gunner and then began to pour it into the plane. Black smoke began to stream out of him and he started to lose altitude fast. I didn't want to get too far out to sea, so I headed for Wheeler Field and didn't see this fellow crash." Army officials, however, saw things differently. Since Welch's gunfire had heavily damaged Goto's Val and Welch witnessed its crash, the victory was officially credited to him. Taylor and Welch continued to engage other Vals, managing to damage several and watching them trail smoke. Though they didn't see any additional crashes, running low on ammunition, both pilots broke off the fight and independently set course for Wheeler Field. Over the years, the timing and details of Taylor and Welch's combat over Iwa have been scrutinized and at times questioned. The confusion can be attributed to the fog of war and inconsistent record-keeping, but the pilots themselves inadvertently added to the controversy. In testimony before the Roberts Commission on December 26, 1941, Taylor provided details that conflicted with the known sequence of events. He stated that after taking off from Haleiwa, Lieutenant Welch and myself started patrolling the island. There wasn't any .50 caliber ammunition, so we landed at the field. Taylor's testimony omitted any mention of the battle over Iwa, and both pilots primarily focused on describing their second sortie during their testimony, leaving the impression that all combat took place after their scramble from Wheeler. Any lingering inconsistencies were resolved when their Distinguished Service Cross citations explicitly included their combat actions between Haleiwa and Iwa. After landing at Wheeler, Taylor and Welch quickly climbed into their rearmed P-40s for a second mission. They took off just as a Japanese second wave formation was approaching the field. Eyewitnesses reported that Taylor began firing his guns while still on the takeoff roll. Once airborne, Taylor immediately engaged, firing head-on into a Val dive bomber. However, a second Val piloted by Saburo Makino attacked him from behind. One of Makino's bullets shattered Taylor's canopy, pierced his left arm, struck the metal trim tab, and sent shrapnel into his legs. Despite his injuries, Taylor executed a high G-turn to shake his pursuer. At that moment, Welch intervened. To avoid overshooting Makino's Val, he skillfully deployed his flaps, slowing his aircraft and positioning himself to open fire. Using his .50 caliber machine guns, Welch unleashed a relentless barrage. Mrs. Paul Young, standing in her doorway in Wahiawa, witnessed the dramatic scene as Welch's gunfire tore through the Val. Makino's D-3A pitched downward, clipped the top of a eucalyptus tree in her backyard, and crashed into a nearby pineapple field. This marked Welch's third confirmed kill of the day. Shortly after, he scored another victory by downing a Zero near Barber's Point. Despite his wounds, Taylor cleared his tail and engaged a Val flown by Iwaoka. Braving a hail of gunfire from the rear seat gunner, Taylor relentlessly attacked, ultimately sending Oka's aircraft crashing near the entrance to a civilian Conservation Corps camp. Several other Pineapple Air Force pilots also engaged in combat that Sunday morning, before Commander Fuchida regrouped the second wave and departed around 10 a.m. Of the 19 Army Air Force pursuit pilots who took to the skies during the attack, they managed to shoot down 11 Japanese aircraft, claim 5 probable kills, and damage at least 2 others. Japanese records confirmed the loss of 29 aircraft over Oahu during the Pearl Harbor attack, with an additional 19 aircraft jettisoned from their carriers due to extensive battle damage. On December 11th, the Honolulu Star-Bulletin published a report attributed to General Short, stating that the Army's pilots had shot down 20 Japanese aircraft during the attack. The American pilots and airmen who faced off against the Japanese in aerial combat at Pearl Harbor undoubtedly encountered overwhelming odds, extreme danger, and widespread confusion. Despite the chaos, the small group of inexperienced young lieutenants fought bravely and effectively, often performing better than expected. Interestingly, no one discouraged them from engaging in direct dogfights with the nimble Zeros and Vals. Instead, they engaged their adversaries in classic one-on-one aerial battles. Unfortunately, most Americans remain unaware of these modest yet important aerial victories, and tend to remember Pearl Harbor solely as an unmitigated naval disaster. Perhaps the sentiment surrounding this view is best expressed by Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, who was the commander of the Pacific Fleet on December 7th. Watching the attack unfold from his office window, Admiral Kimmel flinched as a spent bullet shattered the glass, striking him in the chest and leaving a dark smudge on his white uniform. Picking up the bullet, he muttered, "It would have been merciful had it killed me." Taylor and Welch were depicted in the 1970 film Tora, Tora, Tora. After the Pearl Harbor attack, Taylor was assigned to the 44th Fighter Squadron and went to the South Pacific at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. He was able to record 2 additional aerial kills, the first on January 27th and the other on December 7th, 1943, exactly 2 years after Pearl Harbor. After the war, Taylor flew jets in the Philippines as a major. He served in various command roles until his retirement in 1967. He had reached the rank of Brigadier General. Taylor worked in insurance until his death in 1985. George Welch returned to the continental United States to give war bond speeches until being assigned to the 36th Fighter Squadron of the 8th Fighter Group in New Guinea. He survived the war, but in October 1954, as a test pilot of the F-100 Super Sabre, flying with Chuck Yeager, the F-100 disintegrated during the flight, and despite ejecting, Major Welch was critically injured and died of his injuries. He was sadly just 36 years old.